the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is Apparatuses, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Thanks for joining us on another edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before Taylor and I get started with our discussion today, consider throwing us $1 a month at patreon.com/MUHH, or leave us a review on iTunes. To that note, I had forgotten to shout out the people that had left us the banger episode reviews. So shout out to Xenosided, Arc_Keeper, and No Easy Answers podcast for the iTunes reviews. Taylor, I'll let you introduce our topic today because I think you have a better overall kind of grasp in terms of why you chose this, the motivation behind that, and kind of like where it fits into, I guess, the context of our work together or discussions together.
We are finishing up our Anti-Oedipus walkthrough chapter by chapter and really subsection by subsection almost, trying to squeeze that text for all of its worth. And we're sort of coming to the tail end of chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus, where they are looking at the formations of states based on archaeological, ethnological, ethnographic evidence, and particularly with a kind of novel reading of Marx's kind of critical, ironic, universal history from the light of capitalism. So I was thinking that one text that always seems included in every upper undergraduate humanities seminar or, intro to theory seminar in graduate school is Althusser's Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, which he subtitles Notes Toward an Investigation. And you can find it in his volume, Lenin and Philosophy, and other essays. That volume is a nice little volume to introduce oneself to Althusser, but particularly this essay stands out. It's also freely available on Marxist.org in a nicely transcribed edition.
Yeah, I'll throw a link in the show notes for sure for everyone.
Yeah. And so it's a great introduction, not only to Althusser, and sometimes this is all anyone ever reads of him, for better or worse. I won't say whether or not. I mean, I think that Althusser's also got some interesting writings on Freud and Lacan in relation to Marx. That reason alone kind of puts him in the purview of some of the things that are going on in French theory at the time, which is the conjunction of Freud and Marx. Obviously Althusser is pretty famous for being a professor of Marxist philosophy, of these questions regarding historical materialism and dialectical materialism, this sort of move towards an anti-humanism that he finds in Marx as a corrective against what became this commonplace move in his time to look at like the early Marx and to bring out these notions of a humanist Marx, on concepts like the species being of man and all this. And he tries to periodize Marx's works, kind of show the development towards the kind of mature work in Capital and beyond. And he, wants to seize upon this break, this epistemological break, as he calls it, in Marx's work to elaborate an anti-humanism that doesn't privilege like the essence of man, this kind of essentialist Marx that we see in the young Marx, which I think is actually a pretty good corrective to some of the stuff that happened in the 20s and 30s with Kojève's lectures on Hegel, because we got the humanist Hegel with his sort of readings of the phenomenology of spirit. So Althusser also, and I'll just really quickly, the reason why it helps illuminate Anti-Oedipus is, for some of the reasons we talked about a few minutes before we started recording, is how is it that the sort of conditions of the reproduction of the relations of production, i.e., how is it that the conditions underlying the reproduction of social and psychic repression, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, how do they find their intense generative forces in a way that doesn't merely look at the state as kind of an abstract concept, but looks at these ancillary cooperative apparatuses that he's calling ideological state apparatuses. And I think that this helps to give some background to some of Deleuze and Guattari's thought. I mean, this is published first in 69 and then revised with a little postscript in 70. So it's fresh in the intellectual milieu when Deleuze and Guattari are writing Anti-Oedipus in, it probably starting in 69, 70, 71. Obviously, Anti-Oedipus was published in 72, but it would be directly fresh off the presses for them and be in that milieu. So the last thing I'll say about Althusser and why I see him, even if they reject some of his basic concepts like ideology, which we'll get into, his constant kind of need, a lot of Althusser's interventions is this need to show that the Marxist dialectic, as he sees it and elaborates it, is completely different from the Hegelian dialectic. And it can't merely be understood as this famous phrasing of
turning Hegel right side up.
Yeah.
Or on the side or whatever.
As inverting Hegel, that Marx doesn't merely invert Hegel, because to do so, you kind of keep the same structural tendencies, including, for example, the simplicity of contradiction. For Althusser, with Marx, no contradiction is ever simple. It's always overdetermined and has a sort of a multiplicity of factors, and it's always in uneven development throughout societies. So Althusser's kind of quest to sort of dissipate the specter of Hegel that threatens Marxist philosophy, I think that is one of the ways I would start with articulating how he and Deleuze and Guattari could have at least a starting point, a springboard for a dialogue, even if they don't coincide, and even if Deleuze and Guattari are obviously going off into a totally different stratosphere. I
guess I would bring up just briefly, for those who don't know, just the importance of just some biographical details on Althusser, having taught Derrida, Foucault, Michel Serres. And I think probably I think there's a lot of, although probably sort of different at the end of the day, but you can see certainly within Foucault's work, at least early on, the influence of Althusser, and at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
This is the second time I've engaged with this essay. The first time was to provide a little bit of color and in our discussions when I was doing the Ego book series on Max Stirner's The Unique in Its Property. And so I'd found some resonances in between what Althusser says in this essay and what some of the things that Stirner says in The Unique in Its Property. And I pulled some quotes from that because I had those. Luckily, I still had those notes just to throw that little wrinkle in there, which I guess sort of makes sense, right? As Stirner is kind of this post-Hegelian. Does Althusser reference German ideology here?
Yeah,
I can't remember because I was looking through. I did take it. You had mentioned, and I'm also curious too about what drove you to read Malice on Practice, and then the other essay on the young Marx from Althusser. Yeah, I read those. I did a really cursory skimming so I could just kind of look for what you were going for. So I'm definitely, just to put a flag in that as well, I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, the other
what your game plan was there, because that's kind of unorthodox for you. So
right. The other stuff I read for today is Althusser's Marxism and Humanism, which I mentioned briefly, which is important for elaborating Marxist anti-humanism, this move away from the language of, say, the manuscripts of 1844, where this notion of a species being of man. I also read the thesis on Feuerbach, which is always good to go back and look at, because Althusser provocatively kind of says that the 11 theses on Feuerbach are these apparently simple declarative statements that are actually kind of riddles and have these ambiguous knots and can't necessarily be taken at face value. So I reread those.
Yeah, that's interesting because, of course, Feuerbach is particularly in the crosshairs of Stirner.
And I want to hear a quote.
Also,
a quote that he pulled soon from
real quick too. I just wanted to mention also, so that you mentioned the anti-humanist strain within Althusser, and I think that is where I see as well. What Foucault kind of gets involved with, or at least you can kind of linearly see maybe that connection to where he draws that from, or kind of gets that idea.
I know that one of the people in the crosshairs, it's not the only and not even the prime one, because Althusser is mostly criticizing Marxist philosophers that are going back to the early young Marx and kind of what he's saying, taking up a pre-Marxist point of view with humanism. But, existentialism and humanism that Sartre was famous for, that lecture, it's obviously one of his most famous and accessible texts, but it's almost anachronistic at the time, or at least seemingly it went against the current if you consider what people like Deleuze and Foucault, as you've mentioned, and Althusser go on to. In fact, Deleuze famously did not like that essay, even though he loved being in nothingness and read it over a weekend. You can just imagine just him devouring it. I also read Althusser's On the Materialist Dialectic on the Unevenness of Origins, and that I thought was helpful. But again, a lot of it is sort of discussing Marxist philosophy within Marxism. I read the intro and preface to For Marx, which kind of sets out what he's trying to do with his interventions in Marxist philosophy in the 60s. I read Contradiction and Overdetermination being one of Althusser's other kind of famous borrowings, really, but he's introducing the concept of overdetermination from linguistics and psychoanalysis into Marxist philosophy. Yeah. And I mentioned just a moment ago that, his beef with Hegel, or this Hegelian reading of Marx, is that contradiction would be simple and would be sort of the self-movement of the idea, this autogenesis, whereas, in sort of real historical context, it would be always complex and always have more than one aspect and more than one contradiction working at the same time. So, and then I read On the Young Marx and On Marxism. On the Young Marx was interesting because it gave the background for why he rejects the sort of humanism of young Marx. And what the young Marx texts help too is to show that, chapter 3 of Libidinal Economy, which is one of the densest and deepest chapters, Lyotard juxtaposes the young Marx and the old Marx. And so what I think is a kind of interlocutor in that discussion is what Althusser is kind of bringing up with this. There's this return to young Marx that's going on in the 40s and 50s and 60s in which he's writing, and he sees it as this kind of regressive move to that instead of supplementing and complementing works like Capital, the young Marx is being kind of taken as the manuscripts, for example, are being like analyzed and broken down into these elements, and just in the unity is destroyed. And then there's this teleological movement where it's like, okay, what do these concepts mean now that we've broken the unity down? What does it mean in light of the old Marx? And Althusser sees that as a kind of a violence being done, where you're imposing this natural evolution of Marx onto these early texts as though there were this seed that were naturally blooming into the tree of Marxism.
Really quickly on that note, do you think that represents something that would be worthwhile investigation for us to go back, juxtapose that chapter with the Althusser?
Yeah, I mean, I think that because we spent
as much as I love that book, so just any excuse to.
Yeah, we spent 2 sessions on that chapter,
right? Not
Not only because it's long, but because it's dense,
right?
And I think that one of the things that I didn't realize was how much cachet and how much theoretical debate was going on in France in the 60s and 50s with the young Marx, and the rediscovery of these unpublished manuscripts, and sort of the impact they had on these debates about the sort of past, present, and future of Marxist philosophy. So I think Althusser's interventions there kind of give some indication of how he thinks the text should be read, which is as a unity, as a part of its historical moment, and not as a let's pick and choose parts that we like and see them in light of this future anterior from capital backwards, and in a way that distorts the struggles and the development that Marx was living through. It's not as though Marx had the end goal in mind at the time, right? I think that's kind of Althusser's basically realist way of trying to read it, is don't break this all up and then judge it by the light of later Marx. Doing so leads to this impasse, or leads to sort of these blind alleyways, these dead ends. And I think that part of what Lyotard is doing by juxtaposing the young organic Marx and the old critical Marx, the young girl Marx and the old man Marx, has a lot to do with this discussion. Whether or not Althusser was the main inspiration for that chapter is something that we could investigate, but it seems to have been kind of hotly debated in a way that I think, or at least that I didn't quite know, and that could just be due to my ignorance of sort of French Marxism. But it's something that came to light in the reading. And the reason why I read the Mao on practice is that, Althusser puts this high price on theory with a capital T, which is basically Marxist philosophy, as opposed to what he calls, in the ISA essay, philosophy as ideology, or ideological philosophy, which is because he's quoting from the German ideology, where basically Marx is declaiming philosophy. There's a way, though, that Althusser kind of, by elaborating theory with a capital T, he's kind of redoing the thing that Marx is fighting against, and setting up philosophy as the arbiter of historical materialism. And it's setting up this tribunal whereby philosophy is able to be the sort of the ultimate guarantor of the truth of sort of the raw material of historical facts, and rid it of the ideology. What gives philosophy the right? It seems kind of paradoxical. So with Mao, what I liked was the fact that, contra Althusser, Mao's on practice really, in a very straightforward way, constantly articulates the notion of practice, the notion of this unity of theory and praxis, in this sort of recursive and reiterative dialogue of saying and doing, of thinking, of knowing and doing, and thinking and doing, in a way that Althusser seems sometimes to intimate is true, but in the end seems to again set up theory as the ultimate arbiter. And I think that that's why someone like E.P. Thompson in The Poverty of Theory wants to call out Althusser and say that Marx and Engels would have immediately rejected Althusser's type of idealism, this academic type of idealism. Anyway, that remains to be seen. But we're going to talk about ideology and ideological state apparatuses, because I think that it still has a lot of relevance today.
Yeah, absolutely. As we were saying, kind of pre-show, I was, once you put that seed in my head that this was relevant for Anti-Oedipus, it really did kind of crystallize a lot of the same sort of moves. I thought, in my opinion, at least in my reading, I felt like a lot of the same moves were being made, or at least a lot of the same gestures, although, perhaps with alternative terminology or conceptually different. But the real, the heart of the matter being, ultimately desiring production, or like schizoanalysis, play a big part of what we're discussing. Or really, maybe schizoanalysis is on the periphery of this discussion, but I think desiring production comes right to the core of what this essay was talking about. At least that's my take on it. Coming back to this after having explored Anti-Oedipus, I mean, even down to he's talking about even things like inscription, ritual, practice, etc., right? The coding of flows, the decoding of flows is kind of how I read that. But
what we need to then see is how much ideology, as he describes it and defines it, and he does define it in this essay, although he defines it in various ways throughout his essays. Sometimes he'll talk about ideology as the system of images, representations, and myths that coincide with the organization of a social formation. That's kind of a long-winded way of saying it, but he defines it much more individually in this essay whereby he says that ideology is the imaginary relationship of man's relation to the concrete conditions of existence, right?
Mhm.
So it's this imaginary relation, and he'll try to go at pains then to say that in the end, even if it's this imaginary relation of individuals to their real conditions of existence, it still has material underpinnings.
Force. Yeah.
And so that's where we need to see, and we'll try to get to this. We shouldn't jump to it immediately, but we'll have to come back to this question about where is the correspondence between ideology and desire, and then where perhaps do D&G find ideology as elaborated by Althusser not to have the conceptual explanatory force that they think is needed for something like schizoanalysis.
Yeah. I'll just say really quickly, yeah, I was reading ideology as like a overcoded flow, effectively. We can come back to that. But that's kind of what I was thinking of. You could sort of replace ideology with desire in a sense in this essay, and it still kind of is getting at the same thing, although, yeah, like methodologically, perhaps it's different. But I don't know. Like I said, it's kind of gesturing. It's in the same ballpark move-wise, I think.
Yeah, the question with overcoded flows is perhaps, I think that the only thing I would push back on is, for Deleuze and Guattari, overcoded flows are overcoding as a social process is exemplified and dominant in the despotic regime, right? In the despotic territorial machine.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're speaking very broadly, perhaps overcoding can coexist in a sort of secondary supplementary role in capitalist formations or in primitive territorial machines. But, with that caveat, I think that there's something interesting to discuss there. So,
I mean, there's some stuff that gestures towards like name of the father as well in here that I thought, which is kind of, I think, in that same ballpark. And there's like even a not quite an Oedipal critique. He recognized the family as a sort of apparatus of like an institutional apparatus in itself.
Yeah, it's an
listed
ISA
among them, right? Yeah,
that's right. Obviously, we could start anywhere, but the main reason why Althusser tries to bring up the fact that apart from what he calls the state power, he'll say, okay, so let's just be general. We have the state as a concept, and it is a functionary of a certain form of ruling class, right? It is the functionary of a certain form of state power. And it's, he calls it a machine of repression, right? He calls it a repressive machine, a repressive apparatus.
Right. Yeah.
But he wants to distinguish between that form of state power and the state apparatus in general. And one of his reasons being is that, you can have coup d'etat, and while the state power may apparently change, the apparatus has remained the same. Right.
Yeah.
And more or less the relations of exploitation and repression are conserved, even if the people in power have shifted.
Which feels like he's taking a shot at the Bolshevik Revolution or the USSR.
Well, for
orthodox Marxism or whatever.
I mean, for a long time, he was supportive of Stalinism until, the 50s and 60s, when he had to come to the obvious conclusion that there developed a cult of personality around Stalin. And there was, even if he contributed certain theoretical interventions that are more or less worthy, you have to call them out for the type of repression that you would find in any dictatorship. What Althusser is trying to ask in general, not just for the state, but for all modes and means of production, is, and the reason why he brings up ideological state apparatuses is, how does the state, let's just say, as an example, reproduce the conditions of its production? For him, it's the fact that, as we'll see, for him, that he names a number of them, although the list is incomplete, but he'll say that outside of the state and its repressive apparatus, right, outside of of it, but in conjunction with it, there are these other apparatuses.
Yeah.
The ideological apparatus, where so he says the religious ISA, right? The different churches. Obviously, in France, especially, you had the sort of, even in Althusser's time, a kind of dominance of the Catholic Church, although not as much as you had it in the monarchies. The educational ISA, the family ISA, the legal ISA, and the legal ISA is interesting because law is both a part of the state apparatus itself, right? But there are also sort of juridical legal ISAs that function in cohort with the courts and the police. The political ISA, right? The political system, the parties, the trade union ISA, the communication ISA, where he says press, radio, television. We could say social media too, with that more loosely, perhaps. And then the cultural ISA. I'm sure there could be others, but these are the ones he sort of names.
Focus on, yeah.
And all of them in concert help to reproduce the conditions of the production of repression, exploitation, but also the means of reproducing the productive forces, right? They function in a collaboration with preparing workers. And this is why he says, with the French Revolution, because he's French, so he's considering France as his main example. There's nothing wrong with that. Although he does kind of give examples from England and Germany, but for the most part, the French Revolution wasn't just the sort of victory of the bourgeoisie against the monarchy and the aristocrats. It was also a sort of revolt against the power of the church in its collaboration with the monarchies in terms of tithing and land ownership and these other things, including the province of education, right? So he kind of says that
which kind of makes sense, right? Like this, he talks about the evolution of the passing of the torch in terms of the sort of standard barrier for ISAs transitioning from the church, who I think had sort of, like the state has the monopoly on violence. The church, the Catholic Church in particular, at least within Europe and the West, had a monopoly on the production of knowledge for a long, long time, right? The scribes, the priests,
knowledge, culture,
monks, etc. Right? The illuminated, going back to illuminated manuscripts, etc., and the sort of clergy being the learned bourgeois. The function of the apparatus is identical. It's just a different form, I guess.
And you can kind of see that the way he'll describe it, no ISA is completely separate, even if they're all relatively autonomous, they're determined in the last instance by the repressive state apparatus.
And see, here's where I saw basically perhaps the three the conjunctions, disjunctions, right? Between all of these different apparatuses. You could probably do like a flow chart or like diagnostic of how these sort of circle back on one another, right? With these kind of feedback loops, etc., that connect each one and like.
Yeah, the syntheses of
right.
Production, recording, and consumption.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in the 18th century, the church was the predominant ISA, right? It conjoined the family, right? Because even in the 20th century, you had all kinds of rituals of birth, of coming of age, of death is all within the church. It also had a cultural role, as you mentioned, right? It had the printing press begins with Gutenberg and Gutenberg's Bible. So the press, the communications ISA was largely dominated, I say, because he'll always use the thing about, when we think about Marx and the infrastructure and superstructure, the infrastructure, the base being the economic, and the superstructure being the cultural, the religious, the ethical, etc., the ideological, he'll always use the Marxist language that, the superstructure in the last instance is determined by the infrastructure. And the same thing could be said of the ISAs, that in the last instance, they are determined by the sort of base repressive state apparatus. And yet they have these ancillary functions of, they also have this reciprocal kind of secondary interrelation and reaction upon the base. This is why he says that the state doesn't have a monopoly on repression, that there's no fully or purely repressive apparatus, nor is there a fully purely ideological apparatus. The difference being the dominant mode of the state apparatus is repressive, violent. But secondarily, it has an ideological function, right?
Yeah.
Because it's precisely the embodiment of the ruling class's ideology. And the same could be said, but inversely for the ISAs, right? That they have
violence.
That the violence is the secondary aspect, whereas ideology and the reproduction of ideology as being able to reproduce the conditions of production, the means of production, is their primary focus. And you can think about this. I mean, he gives examples of, like, with the press, censorship, right? That's a kind of repressive form, but also with the church and excommunication, that threat of eternal damnation, that's a kind of violent, repressive, and not merely ideological role. So his point kind of being the collaboration between the family as the unit of the reproduction of production, but also the sort of finality, the unit of consumption, which is language that D&G will use very clearly, that moves in modern capitalist societies from the religious being the dominant ISA to the educational system, to the school and the sort of confederation of schools, and the sort of complicity between families and schooling becomes the dominant mode. And I think that we could still see that today. I mean, especially in red states in America, so many questions.
That's the ethical battleground currently, right? Is because of the critique of, this critical race theory, etc. Also, the books that are being
the books that are banned,
etc.
don't say gay laws, right? The question of alternate modes of sexuality, which themselves they're not disconnected from this concern with the reproductions of production.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
I mean, reproduction in another sense too, right? This question of whether sex should be primarily taught as, abstinence or saving for marriage because the family, right? And because of reproducing children who would be reared in steeped in the same ideological waters in order to produce good workers.
Yeah, it's not enough to merely reproduce labor power. You have to reproduce good, complicit, docile labor power, right?
That's right. So
desire your own repression.
And
is the lesson, right?
And it's interesting that there's not even a pure separation, even if the religious ISA becomes subordinate to the educational, it's not disconnected from it, because we still hear this every now and then. We still hear this question of prayer in schools, evolution taught in schools. And evolution isn't some disinterested neutral theory. It's precisely because it threatens a certain type of reading, of a fundamentalist type of reading of the Bible and Christian ideology. So, there's still this way in which the religious is mingled. It's not like it's fully supplanted. It's just it's not predominant anymore.
Yeah. I'll inject a personal story really briefly. Just along these lines would be that my 7th and 8th grade science teacher did not believe in evolution. And he got very upset with my best friend because my best friend did believe in evolution. And I think I've even said this before on the podcast, but he was like, you might have come from a dang monkey, but I didn't come from no dang monkey. But anyways.
Well, there's a famous
Yay education. Yeah, the Scopes monkey trial, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's exactly that. I mean, that was in the 1920s, but still is relevant today. So the question of religion isn't just prayer in schools, although that's still debated, and it coincides, but doesn't fully. It overlaps with, but it doesn't fully consume the debates about teaching sex and alternate modes of teaching sex, and whether or not alternate modes of sexuality beyond the heteronormative should be allowed in discussions, alternate modes of birth control.
It goes back to the dialectic between the coded, those who want the coded and who want the decoded flows.
But it also comes to this question of teaching creationism, which, if you're teaching it in school, has little to no scientific value. among scientists, right? But is obviously a purely, it's sort of on the nose ideological form to try to reproduce a certain type of, in this sense, you're not just trying to reproduce good workers, but you're also, comes down to a kind of ethno-nationalist reproduction, because now you're getting into this question of reproducing Christians, specifically white Christians.
Right.
You're kind of getting into this role of
nation states and peoples or something like that.
Right. The kind of demographic that seeks to perpetuate itself in a narcissistic way and in a racist way and in a chauvinistic way. That's the word that Althusser uses, chauvinism, which the way that the word became later, chauvinism usually just means kind of like male supremacy, but chauvinism in general is a kind of perpetuation of a certain type of ideological supremacy, right? And usually an insularity, right? Because he talks about French chauvinism when he's kind of saying that part of the problem with scholarship on Marx for Althusser was the fact that only a certain contingent of very diligent Germanists were doing this difficult work of reading Marx, closely in the unpublished manuscripts in German, whereas the French really only cared what happened. I mean, he's saying this broadly, but really only cared what happened within the boundaries of France, within the French language. So there's a kind of chauvinism there, right? This kind of, it implies narcissism, it implies a hostility or ignorance of the other, things like that.
It was interesting that, and I mentioned this a little while ago I thought it was kind of interesting that Althusser speaks about this transition that we discussed from the clergy to the church edifice to the university as like the university discourse re Lacan, right? Althusser would be considered, that's structural Marxism, right?
That's at least what he became famous for, elaborating when the different structuralisms arose: structuralist linguistic, structuralist anthropology with Levi-Strauss, structuralist, psychoanalysis, even if Lacan may or may not have really, he did talk about structure, and at least in terms of the symbolic and entering the symbolic. Structuralist Marxism would be associated with Althusser. So, and Deleuze delineates the differences and similarities in his essay on how do we recognize structuralism, and he includes Althusser and these others in that role. So, this ISA essay is a good peek into what structuralist Marxism would look like, particularly in this question that he asks: how are the conditions of production reproduced and secured?
You mentioned having some interest in the quotes I pulled from Stirner on this topic. So if it's okay with you, I think I might go ahead and read a couple. So the independent existence of the state establishes my lack of independence. Its naturalness, its organism, demands that my nature doesn't grow freely, but is cut to fit it, so that it can develop naturally. It applies the shears of civilization to me. It gives me an education and culture suitable to it, and teaches me, for example, to respect the law, to abstain from the violation of state property, i.e. private property, to revere a divine and earthly sovereignty, etc. In short, it teaches me to not be culpable, by which I mean to sacrifice my ownness to sacredness. Everything possible is sacred, for example, property, the lives of others, etc. This is the sort of civilization and culture the state is able to give me. It teaches me to be a useful tool, a useful member of society. And then here's a second one. Efforts to mold all human beings into moral, rational, pious, human, etc. essences, i.e. training, have been in vogue from time immemorial. They are shipwrecked on the indomitable sense of self, on own nature, on egoism. And those, of course, are gleaned from The Unique and Its Property by Max Stirner.
It sounds very harmonious with what we're discussing here. It could work as a footnote in Althusser's essay. This question of the educational ISA becoming dominant in modern capitalist societies does sort of work pretty well with some things we can find in, say, like Guattari, when Guattari's looking at, when he seems to be inordinately obsessed with linguistics and linguistics as an imperialism, when he's looking at questions of agrammaticality and asignifying signs and things like this. One of the things he says, among many others is this notion that no one is supposed to be ignorant of the law, right? No one is supposed to be ignorant of the legal ISA, let alone, let's say, like the political ISA or the cultural ISA or the communications ISA, right? There's supposed to be this, not just a certain know-how and skills that we are that we glean from education, but we're supposed to sort of be this well-rounded person to function in society. But the main thing is, he's like, if you can't perform the dominant grammaticality, if you can't perform in or function in the dominant grammar, then how can you submit to law? And how can you be found competent? And so you have to be institutionalized, re-educated, right? You have to be sort of protected not only from yourself and from others, but from sort of harming the wholeness and totality of the legal institution. So there's a sense in which, Guattari is isolating, and along with Deleuze, you could see in A Thousand Plateaus more specifically, but Guattari's, a lot of his works, he's kind of articulating among the cultural ISA or along with it, this kind of linguistic, this idiomatic, this language ISA, right? Where it's assumed everyone is supposed to like learn the national language and speak proper French, as Althusser says, right? But that, I don't think that necessarily coincides with what Althusser calls the cultural ISA, which is literature, arts, sports. I think it's its own division or subdivision that is a prerequisite for even functioning within any of these ISAs, right? Acquiring a language in order to take orders, right? Because that's kind of what they say is like language is not about communication, it gives orders. So if you don't have the necessary know-how and wherewithal and skills bequeathed by the linguistic ISA, how can you follow orders or give orders if you're more in step with the ruling ideology, right? Because it's not just about training workers, it's also about training different managerial functionaries. It's about training soldiers, right? Which we know how important that is to obey the hierarchy of command. I think that in that sense, one thing that's missing from Althusser, even if he alludes to it every now and then, is the question of acquiring language so as to submit to the dominant realities, what Althusser would call the state apparatus and the ideological state apparatus. So I think that kind of, he's presupposing and that everyone is rational, everyone is linguistically abled, something that Guattari doesn't presuppose, right? Something that Guattari is, since he's working directly with individuals who have difficulties with this, schizophrenics, psychotics. Yeah, that's something that Guattari is very keen on discussing, that Althusser takes as a given.
Really briefly, I want to do a callback to our episode on Swamp Thing, because just going back to that look at, what is it, the anatomy? No, I guess it's the whole arc, right? From Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. And one portion of this, Jason Woodrue, the Floronic Man, whenever he acquires, I guess, the Swamp Thing's abilities, whenever he attacks the small town of La Croix, right? It's the first three things that he does is he takes the police first, then the schoolhouse, and then the church, in that order. Yeah, which is kind of funny. And I pointed this out in that episode that like this kind of mapped on to this ideological state apparatus.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting that the town name La Croix is the cross. So you might think that the church would be the first to go, but yeah. And maybe if the comic book were set in 18th century, exactly. That would be the first to go.
Certainly 18th century France, right?
Oh yeah, that's a good callback. I think the army, which for Althusser is a part of the repressive apparatus, not itself an ideological state apparatus, which is interesting, right? It's its own kind of. It's a question about, like, for example, the prison, which is something that obviously Foucault is famous for, maybe even stereotypically famous for. But the prison too would be a part of the would be a part of the repressive state apparatus and not ideological. But you can see obviously that with a kind of maybe empty notion like rehabilitation. I'm thinking of Shawshank Redemption when Morgan Freeman's character, the last time he's up for parole, and he's like, rehabilitation is just a bullshit word that that gives people like you, young people like you, the power to wear these fancy suits and throw around. And and feel important. You know, it's interesting to note that obviously the prison isn't merely, even if it's dominantly violent and repressive, depending on the state, there are modes in which rehabilitation is taken more seriously. You know, just think of like Scandinavian prisons versus the American industrial prison complex.
I mean, I just kind of was throwing in that because it kind of just rang. It was a nice little refrain back to that episode. I did think this was kind of interesting where he's sort of tracing the, let's see, I guess the chain, like the production chain or like logistical chain of production and how it all sort of connects in this totality, like in this machine, and how, I don't know, it kind of just reminded me a bit of signifying chains for Lacan, having a similar sort of the production of signs, the production of surplus value, surplus jouissance. I don't know. Those things were kind of like coming to mind when I read this relative to Baudrillard and Lacan in particular.
It's interesting that in like the Grundrisse or in the introduction to a critique of the political economy, you know, Marx is at pains to show that production and consumption, if we consider them in a chain, right? One is the origin and one is the end, you know, at the same time, they fuel one another. Right. And you can't have consumption without production. Obviously, that seems easily conceivable, but you also can't have production without consumption. And the example Marx gives is really cool because it seems like an example that Deleuze and Guattari would give in Anti-Oedipus, because he says, think of a railroad system. Think of a railroad without any trains to move on it. What is it then? You know, I mean, you could say it's a kind of monstrous aesthetic object that's useless, and we could go into like Baudrillard or Bataille and expenditure. But the point being, without the railroad being used up, without it being consumed and consummated in that end, can you really say it's productive? So I thought that machinic example was cool.
That's where the syntheses, I think, are relevant too. I think particularly the last thing you said, right?
Yeah, and the fact that Althusser talks about the state apparatus, which he wants to always qualify as repressive, that he calls it a repressive machine. You know, I do think that there are that kind of way of talking about it is it's Marxist. It's very confluent with Marx, but obviously D&G take the notion of machine and try to run with it and take it to its extreme consequences. And, you know, for them, they discuss the state as an apparatus of capture in A Thousand Plateaus. And it's not just an apparatus of capture insofar as it captures a sort of regional peoples and subordinates them to a central kind of state peoples or despot, but also in the sense in which it captures a war machine that is exterior to it. And this is partly why, you know, some of the things Althusser says about the army, that, you know, if the police is the first on the ground's direct imposition of order and violence, then the army is kind of a last resort fallback to indirectly impose the will of the repressive apparatus. It's not quite the same, but it has a kind of logic that resonates with this notion that the war machine is exterior and captured. One of the things he turns to, because he has two general theses, and we've talked about one of them, but I guess we should go back over it before we go to the second one, which is that ideology is the imaginary relationship between man and his real conditions of existence. And he does work through how ideology in the end is still material, right? It still concerns material practices. It's still, you know, even if it's not imaginary in the sense in which, well, definitely not in the sense in which Lacan talks about the imaginary. It's not imaginary in any sense in which it's mere illusion, although there's an aspect of that. And it's not even imaginary in the sense in which Marx works it out in his early writings, where it's about this relationship. It's the fact that man is alienated in those real conditions themselves, right? It's imaginary, I think, in the way that I think that for him, it's imaginary in a way that it functions in an unconscious way, right? He says this in other essays, but in this essay, he's trying to make clear the role of consciousness, specifically in the role of us becoming subject, which is one of the most famous parts of the essay, this notion of interpolation or hailing, and how we are always already subjects because even before we're born, and Lacan will say this too, we're sort of, there's already a place marked out for us, right?
Yeah,
even
right.
before we're born, in the symbolic, right, is what Lacan would say.
Yeah, like our being is kind of overdetermined in the last instance.
Yeah, exactly. So this notion that when he's saying imaginary, he's talking about this unconscious relationship, because there's two senses of which it's imaginary, I think, for Althusser. For one, say we are atheists and we're talking about, in the 60s in France, the still fairly dominant religion being Catholicism. I assume Althusser is an atheist, but he doesn't necessarily come out and say it, but he talks about Christianity, especially towards the end of this work, as though he were an atheist. So he says, basically, if we're not in that particular ideology, but we see someone else practicing the rituals of the material existence of this other ideology, like Roman Catholicism, kneeling and praying and all of this, then it's easy to say, oh, that's imaginary. Now, he says that unless we're good Marxists or Spinozas, it's always ideology that someone else does. It's not, right, yeah. I'm never in ideology. Now, he says this ironically because he's saying, no, in fact, ideology isn't contra Marx, around the time of his epistemological break from the ideological young Marx to the scientific continent that he opens up. Ideology is, for him, at least in class societies, because there's a sense in which classless societies potentially might mark another break in history or whatever. But within class societies, he's kind of, insofar as the last instance is the class struggle, he's trying to say that ideology is kind of the lived unconscious movement whereby our system of representations is determined by the organization of the social formation, etc. So there's a sense in which, for
by
him,
the body without organs, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, the body without organs and the socius in that tension. So there's a sense in which it's imaginary insofar as it's unconscious, insofar as we have to live through and struggle against the sort of ideological plating and system of representations, and in fact use the ideology of the ruling class against itself. So there's a sense in which we have to come to consciousness through class struggle to sort of turn the ideological platings and turn it into a weapon. But the lived sense in which we sort of swim through ideology as though it's our milieu, I think that for him is why it's imaginary, because it's almost too immediate, right? We live through it, and if we claim to be outside it, that's in some instances that's really when we are deeply within it, because of this kind of denial and repression, to use Freudian terms that he's not unwilling to turn to. Yeah. So I think that we talked about this a little bit, but this is where, Deleuze and Guattari are kind of illuminating, because in the very basic example they take up from Reich, where Reich is one of the first to put the question in such clear terms, is why, and Spinoza did this too, but Reich, in the conjuncture that they're working in, it's not enough to say that the masses were duped. There's a way in which you're begging the question. There's a way in which you're avoiding the real problem. It's not enough to say that the masses were duped by fascism. The point is to analyze and to sort of articulate how they desired fascism. And if you're not asking that question or posing the question in those terms, you're still sort of begging the question. You're still sort of presupposing what you wish to explain.
I think interestingly here, the dialectic or the contradiction between anarchist thought and, one might say, like Marxist Leninism. So the anarchist critique is commensurate with Althusser in that unless you're just merely having the leadership, the state, who's in control of the state apparatus, change, that alter does not merely rid you of the of the ideological apparatus underneath, right? And I think Marxists are actually probably more schooled on this in the sense that what anarchism lacks, conversely, is that it doesn't have a theory that explains how social change occurs, because anarchism is this sort of more modernist, rational approach. I rationally realize that between you and I, our ability to come together and diminish and like willingly lay down our egos to exchange whatever between us is rational. Therefore, why can't we just do that, right? Why can't we just be rational and realize that cooperation is a rational end? Like, why can't we just simply merely flip that switch without some type of historical process? And I think that's what the science of Marxism attentions to do, is to understand how change works at the level of the body without organs, at the level of the socius, rather than at the level of individual consciousness. And I think that's the strength of Marxist critique, is the understanding that no, it's not just simply about changing the conscious mind, right? There's an unconscious, and that unconscious goes directly to desire, which circles back around to this question of why do the masses desire their own repression?
I think that's a really nice way to put it, and that exactly shifts the terrain to Deleuze and Guattari and why they refuse to continue to work within the conceptual framework of explaining via ideology. Because I think that the easiest way the way that I try to understand this, and it's the fact that it's not explanatory enough. It doesn't really help to say that the German masses or whatever submitted to Nazi ideology, or they lived Nazi ideology, they subscribed to it, they believed in it. All these different ways of framing ideology, for them, it has to be more directly, as you said, put in unconscious terms in ways that are a little bit more provocative, I think, but also a little bit more explanatory, which is this question of desire. That you can have pre-conscious and conscious interests that are governed by reason and understanding, but
right.
That doesn't get to the heart of unconscious motivations and investments. And there's a sense in which I think that Althusser is sort of slouching towards, it's crawling towards this notion of unconscious investment with ideological state apparatuses.
Right.
But I think that Deleuze and Guattari, when they say in A Thousand Plateaus that ideology does not exist and has never existed, it's not necessarily to say that there isn't this way in which we live through these prejudices we've inherited, this worldview that we've inherited, but it's that ideology doesn't explain that. It doesn't get to the heart of what they want to try to elaborate more explicitly with the formations of desire, which for them is not merely individual in our hearts and minds. It is directly machined and engineered. It is directly invested in the socius and not some sort of epiphenomenon. Because I think that that's what happens for Deleuze and Guattari, is how do you save ideology from becoming this epiphenomenal thing, rather than, even if you say it's like material and it's lived, how do you keep it from merely coinciding with the dominant system of representations? Because for them, desire isn't a system of representations and images. It can have something to do with them, and those can be, but the system of representations and images, they become secondary to the lived affect, the lived sort of confluence of desire, which is always determined by a social formation, which is sort of always in this negotiation, and which is not necessarily caught in, either the family or any of the ISAs, right? But is open to them, and in some senses also is struggling against them, and not merely determined by them. Even in the last instance, I think that, that language of a last instance gets collapsed when desire and the infrastructure are seen as identical, but having differing regimes. This is the difficult part where the last instance doesn't sort of leaves out the back door, along with other transformations of Marxist philosophy in Anti-Oedipus, which, Brazier noted in that essay on the human, if you remember, which we didn't get to ask him about, but this notion about, for Deleuze and Guattari, for example, the uber explanatory concept not just in Mao, but in Althusser, and I suppose in Lenin, I'd have to check more. It's been a while since I've read his works, is class struggle, right? When it's like,
class struggle is the motor of history.
That's right. So for Marx too. And I think for Deleuze and Guattari, when they say something provocative like
the bourgeois is the only revolutionary class,
there is one class, that I think is hard to swallow from, you could consider all their attacks on Freudianism and Lacanianism hard to swallow, but something like that for a Marxist.
For Marxists, that's but I would agree. Like, I do agree that I just don't think that history has shown that this class struggle being the motor of history holds up. But maybe that's because my understanding is poor, or I don't know. My knee-jerk reaction, let's say, is that I just don't think that history bears out. If anything, history is struggle. It's more like the history of domination. That's a type of struggle. A struggle against domination, I don't know. Perhaps the struggle against the domination of nature. If you want to go that level, then maybe I'll agree with you. Right? Kind of going back to even what we discussed with Brassier on that notion of this dialectic of nature and culture, and having to dominate nature to reproduce our own, to reproduce the productive system, to reproduce the social, to reproduce our own being. Right. And, when Brassier turns to Hegel at the end of that essay and says that spirit is not mastery, it is the mastery of mastery, it's not domination, it's the domination of domination. This is this is what he proposes as a definition of communism. I'm not sure if that type of analysis isn't that far from Deleuze and Guattari, but the terms would have to be shifted, and I think that this notion of unrooting, as Foucault says at the end of the preface to Any of Us, not to become enamored of power, not to will power, as Nietzsche says, right? That the will to power becomes perverted and bastardized when power is what is willed. Same with war. When the war machine takes war as its object, this is when we start to go down the road of totalitarianism and fascism. So that's the first part of ideology, the first definition of this theory of ideology, which is a helpful definition because sometimes Althusser can be, like many French thinkers, circumlocucious, right? So when he defines ideology not merely as a system of representations or this product of the organization of social formations, which obviously it has ties to because it's in this dialectic between the real conditions of existence and the imaginary relationship that individuals feel with those conditions of existence. I think that that's the first part. So the second part that he says that ideology has no history. And he very quickly says that it's not that ideologies in the plural have no history, because obviously they're going to be a product. They're going to be in this relationship with the social formations, as I said, but that ideology in general has no history. This is where he turns to Freud and turns to this notion that in the same way that the unconscious has no history, ideology has no history, or at least in the same sense in which the unconscious in general has no history, ideology has no history. And I feel like this is where I don't necessarily agree, but I think it's something that we should spend a few moments talking about. And maybe I'll get your thoughts first before, if you had some thoughts about this claim. You already said this, but refresh my memory. Like, I felt like Deleuze and Guattari had said this, or something has no history, or where do I know this from? Like, because this caught me when he said ideology has no history. I immediately went to something that Deleuze and Guattari had said, but I'm not sure. Possible, but that they say this in Parrot Althusser, but it would be at the, or maybe it was the unconscious aspect of it. I don't know. It rang a bell, and I was like, "Oh, okay, this sounds really interesting." Well, I would have to take issue even with Deleuze and Guattari if they said that this unconscious has no history. Sounded really familiar from something I've read, and I just couldn't place it. They say no history one time in Anti-Oedipus, where they cite Marx, and they're citing. They're talking about one of Freud's teachers, Clarenbeau. Clarenbeau is the Feuerbach of psychiatry, the sense in which Marx remarks, whenever Feuerbach looks at things as a materialist, there is no history in his works, and whenever he takes history into account, he is no longer a materialist. That's the one part where they say the phrase no history.
with Freud, two things I would bring up to question whether or not the unconscious has no history. Now, the unconscious doesn't recognize negation. The unconscious perhaps doesn't understand history in the way we do, as a linear successions of events that happens in time, because the unconscious doesn't really grasp time. So
maybe that's it. Maybe it was that the unconscious doesn't have a concept or doesn't know time.
Right. Because when Freud begins, he begins
or have a concept of time or something like that.
He begins Civilization as Discontents with this very interesting metaphor about how if we consulted archaeologists and anthropologists and historians, and we went to Rome, and we could say, okay, maybe Rome started back here on these hills of Palatine, and maybe we can kind of see the outlines of the first kind of structures. But at a certain point, even with the most sensitive tools, we can't see all the way back to the Genesis point. Whereas with the unconscious, if the unconscious were metaphorically conceived analogically as Rome, we would see not only the Parthenon and the Colosseum, but we could see sort of side by side or overlapping in this crazy non-Euclidean space, not only the small Palatine hills upon which Rome began, but everything that came after it, kind of in the way that Walter Benjamin's Angel of History sees history as this one giant catastrophe piling up on itself, instead of it sort of taking this linear shape.
Time is a flat circle.
Yeah, something like that, right? It's time as a flat circle. So there's this notion that if the unconscious doesn't understand history, it's in that sense. When he says that it doesn't have a history, this is paradoxical to me. And perhaps, because I'll leave ideology to one side and but him using Freud's unconscious as a justification point, I don't necessarily think that flies. I mean, not only with this metaphor of Rome, but with the fact that another analogy he uses is the mystic writing pad, right? Where the unconscious is the slate, the slab that's being written upon, and the preconscious is the sheet that lifts, right? And so the unconscious for Freud, sort of, even with the possibility of brain damage, retains all of its received stimuli in this interesting, again, non-Euclidean space where it sort of never forgets. This is why repression is interesting, because it's this function of a collaboration between the preconscious and the unconscious. And it's not like the unconscious is forgetting anything. It's the very fact that the unconscious retains that the traumatic
kernel or whatever.
Yeah, right. Okay. So there's that part, but then there's also this notion that we aren't born with an unconscious. And not even to go with like Guattari and his analyses of the unconscious, but even with Freud, if we consider like individuals having their own little personal unconscious, which, Guattari and Deleuze would kind of want to say, fantasies are collective, the unconscious is machinic, and it's not necessarily our own little space in our heads. But let's just take a basic Freudian model. The infant is not born with the unconscious. It's not born with an ego. These things take the brain since we're born too early, so to speak, right? Since we're born defenseless and helpless, we are not born with these apparatuses of the unconscious, of the ego, of the superego. All of those take place in a psychogenesis that takes time, that evolves.
Right.
And so this notion is suspect to me, that Althusser is trying to articulate. And just one last example, and I'm surprised Althusser himself comes to this notion that ideology has no history, because one of the things that Marx is working against with the backlog of sort of vulgar economists he's working with is the fact that production is kind of taken as a given. Production is taken as a kind of eternal truth, and it's exchange or distribution or even consumption that takes on these historical forms. For Marx, that makes no sense, right? That the mode of production would differ if you're in a Roman slave economy versus a feudal economy versus a modern capitalist economy. Production isn't some eternal truth that falls from the sky. It's the same thing, right? That, when Guattari
has a history. Yeah.
I mean, when Guattari says we have the unconscious we deserve, he's not talking about some sort of eternal given.
Transcendent. Yeah. A priori.
Right. So that is where I don't necessarily agree with Althusser, and I think that it contaminates his discussion of the fact that we are sort of always already subjects, or it's like when we're hailed in the street by "Hey, you," that he says nine out of 10 times the right person turns around, which I don't know where you got that, because I don't know if any of you ever think you've been hailed and turned and waved and made an ass of yourself because you're not being hailed. I mean, like 9 out of 10 times. I don't know about that. Maybe I'm just more obtuse, but the fact that, we become subjects in this hailing, but yet we are always already subjects, right? Because we are hailed before we were born, we are interpolated by the symbolic, blah, blah, blah. This is where I find that a thinker like Foucault, and I know that Will a few weeks ago really exemplified this very well. A thinker like Foucault who moves on to talk about these processes of subjectification that obviously would be historically determined,
contingent,
and some of, to the point where Foucault later is asking about these questions of desubjectification. How can we desubjectify, to the point where Deleuze and Guattari are asking these questions in A Thousand Plateaus, how we can sort of manage to cautiously begin to subtract ourselves away from the dominant signifying order in order to not only to de-stratify, but to desubjectify, to become maybe not purely asubjective, because that could never happen, but at least to sort of embark on this line of flight of becoming imperceptible.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Exactly. This is where I feel like, however helpful it may be for a certain conjuncture to talk about interpolation in the terms in which Althusser brings it up in terms of hailing, I feel like it shows its, I don't want to say it's idealist connotations, but it shows a certain rigidity. It doesn't seem aware of becoming subject is not some sort of one-way street or some sort of pre-given function of individuals, that there's something much more complex going on.
Yeah. I don't think you quite addressed this in that discussion, but what do you think about this corollary statement that ideology has no outside for itself, but at the same time that it is nothing but outside?
This kind of is another way of framing what I was saying earlier, where it's, we see, for the atheists, seeing the Christians praying and doing their rituals and taking the communion, it's, they're in ideology, right? So in that sense, it's always the other who is ideological, not myself, right? So in that sense, it's outside. But on the other hand, as he kind of says, at least in class societies, at least in societies within history, ideology is this kind of milieu, right? Is this kind of milieu that we're never outside of, even if the goal with kind of sort of the scientific theory of Marxism is to rid itself of its ideological trappings. There's a sense in which it is itself a part of class struggle. Insofar as there are classes, there will always be a ruling ideology. And so whether we unconsciously live them and sort of eat it up or use it as a weapon against itself, there's a sense in which ideology is part and parcel of that struggle, if that makes sense. Because he says it is nothing but outside for science and reality. Right?
Yeah.
So that would be the thing. And it's a question if one can ever perfectly do it. I think that for someone like Mao, and this is why I think Mao was really helpful, was, just because you've reached knowledge, a logical knowledge after sort of repeated perceptual inputs, doesn't mean that you can stop there and be like, okay, we're good. It obviously has to resubmit itself to this endless cycle of practice.
The dialectic of
of
the dialectic of culture and nature. Basically, when idea meets material or vice versa, really like in terms of, I guess directly versus the sort of indirect relationship between, I guess, in an intense way, at an intensity that isn't the same as just ideology functioning.
As you said, this interrogation of measuring of concepts and reality of the real.
Because I think maybe that's what the dialectic is all about. It's about failure, right? If you're not allowed, and this is kind of the problem with communism in a sense, is like in terms of economics, right? Because what's dynamic about capitalism is that it allows failure to occur.
It's this question of what Marx saw capitalism would be the producer of its own ends, right? Of its own demise. And Deleuze and Guattari think this as well, but not necessarily in terms of contradictions, right? No one's ever died of contradictions. They're kind of famous for saying that. But they do think that it is only by, at least in the time of Anti-Oedipus, it is sort of, to use the phrase, accelerate capitalism's, they don't really talk about it in terms of contradictions, but in terms of this move towards pushing it towards its exterior limit, right? It's pushing it so fast that it can't renegotiate the different limits in which they analyze it, the interior, the imaginary, the exterior, the immanent limits, pushing it so fast that it can't right itself. Which is why, Guattari says like more gadgets, more things, more bullshit, like just, and whether or not that pans out or will pan out, or whether or not that it's the true way to do it, there is a way in which it both harmonizes with kind of Marx insofar as it's like, we got to have more contradictions. I just think they're wary of that notion of contradiction. That's again why they are abnormal Marxists.
Well, I mean, to me, it's almost like the negative dialectic, because it's difference is always going to reproduce itself, and that's always going to reproduce contradiction within totality, which is going to, you know what I mean? So there is no teleological endpoint. There will always maintain some type of, and that almost goes to that dialectic, or that idea of the scapegoat that I've been kind of on too, right? Like there's almost always this difference, right? The return of difference, in a sense, return of the empire, or the empire strikes back. It's like difference strikes back, because you can't have a whole, like the only way you can have a whole totality is if everything stops, right? If time is a flat circle, and you're like from that privileged vantage point of the eschaton or whatever the fuck.
Yeah, the scapegoat has a positive function for, the signifying despotic regime. You can even say capitalism.
I mean, that would be Durkheim too, which I've like harped on so often about what is deviant is always going to be redefined, because it does have a positive function on the reverse side.
It also has a positive function on the side of power, because it blocks off the line of flight, right?
Yeah.
It turns it into a negative. It turns into a negative image of itself, that which can't be gone beyond. And so, obviously that's why it's not just rooting for the little dog or the underdog. There is a sense in which reclaiming the scapegoat, reclaiming the slur, whatever, there is this way of unblocking that blockage. And again, speaking Althusserian terms, using the dominant ideology against itself, right?
That goes very well to, I think, our discussion with Will, in particular, the way that, he talked about the people that got under the bus tires. The better example is whenever it was in Denver, there was activists, they placed themselves under the wheels of buses, etc., to halt this intersection, right? But here's where it really maximizes the point, is that the police buses did not have wheelchair ramps. So that's
right, because the perpetrators were disabled. So
precisely,
that's a good point, and that's a very potent way of bringing out the contradictions in the system, if we're going to stick within that. And I think that it's helpful here. You're right that the very means they were protesting were used as a weapon against their means of repression and incarceration.
I mean, this also raises a lot of questions relative to the primacy of production, because the disabled, like we said I try to argue, is that the disabled really problematize the fundamental relation of, because
the ideal of production.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, it is a question of,
because you can't really reduce them down to their labor per se.
No. And capitalism still has ways of trying to recoup it, insofar as it's moving
technical apparatus,
moving more and more to a service industry rather than a production industry, at least in certain parts of the West. I mean, America included. So it can find ways of transforming labor power from a more industrial model of producing things to this service economy of producing services, producing value in other ways. But it's, again, so many factors are in contention with this, as Marx already saw: the automation, the need for less and less labor. And Althusser even points it out in this essay, right? This question of the standard minimum wage, not just to have the worker come in and feed himself and clothe himself and come in the next day, but also to raise children, to produce workers in the future, and how that minimum wage itself is historically, socially, regionally
Determined,
locally
right?
determined.
Yeah.
It's
Germans
not,
need beer, French need wine, etc.
I mean, I thought that was nice.
Yeah.
It's nice when Althusser can be concrete and give
Right.
concrete examples, because many times, as Thompson tries to show, Althusser, with his kind of philosophical prejudices, is sometimes he confuses empiricism, right, as denounced by Marx and Kant and others, with empirical facts and procedures, and wants to sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's part of being a sort of academic, right? That's part of being a Marxist from the lecture hall, not to
the smooth skin academic that Leotard goes in on, right?
Yeah, and I think that you can include Althusser there. I mean, but I think that for all of his faults, this essay on the ISAs and looking at how the dominant powers, the different ISAs, help to function to inculcate. Sometimes I get interested in the verbiage. One of the things he says about the ISAs is that they steep people, they steep individuals, like if I could teabag,
right? Yeah,
they steep individuals in ideology. I thought that was a very concrete verb. But the other one is that they are, God, what was
the steep thing is great too, because it allows for this diffusionary instead of this like your die cast. So there's a blurriness on the edges, on the periphery. It's not this totality that you're like stamped with and like forever.
Right. I mean, this is partly why he says ideology is material, because it surrounds us. It's not just ideas in our head. It's not just mental and spiritual, which is why I think that it can still have resonances with Deleuze and Guattari's notion of desire. The other word, well, one of the other things he says, that what's interesting about ISAs, maybe apart from the repressive state apparatus in general, is that they are not just the stakes, but also the sites of class struggle, right? So we can think about pirated radio or even pirated media in our time, like with Napster and these other things. But you can also think about the history of America and the different offshoots of religion, some of which were violently repressed, which, for example, in Rhode Island, I'm trying to think of the Protestant movement that tried to do away with churches and try to really teach this philosophy of a kind of personal connection to God that doesn't even be mediated by any intercessor. I can't remember the name of it, but still, that's kind of an example of the religious ISA. Obviously, different types of schools that may fall in between the public and the private. Obviously, there's homeschooling where you can brainwash your kids with propaganda or try to teach them means of being aware of it. I can't find the other verb he uses, but I'll let you talk for a second while I look.
The way that he brings up Moses and Christ and God duplicating himself via Christ, I thought that was kind of interesting. And even now that I'm thinking about that further, that goes to almost like the infinite debt element of the sacrifice. But man duplicates himself in God, is the way that I would say it.
All right. The other word he says is, he talks about all ideological state apparatuses, whatever they are, contribute to the same result, the reproduction of the relations of production, i.e. of capitalist relations of exploitation. Each of them contributes towards this single result in the way proper to it. The political apparatus, by subjecting individuals to the political state ideology, the indirect parliamentary or direct plebiscitary or fascist democratic ideology. The communications apparatus, by cramming every citizen with daily doses of nationalism, chauvinism, liberalism, moralism, etc., by means of the press, the radio, and television. Same goes for the cultural apparatus. The role of sport and chauvinism is of the first importance, blah, 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 blah. This notion of not just steeping individuals, but specifically the press and the media of cramming the individual. I mean, I think that with the rise of not only reality TV, but just all the streaming services and just the
I mean, that would be Baudrillard. We have more information, overproduction of information, or we have more information and no meaning, or etc.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hyper reality. I mean.
Right. No symbolic exchange, blah, blah, blah. So the individual isn't merely steeped in ideology. He gets crammed by it. And that's a way of jamming too, right? It's a way of like a radar. It's a way of sort of short circuiting the
Lines of,
the lines of
lines
flight,
of flight,
the means
yeah,
of
for sure.
means of awareness, means of attacking the weakest link. Right? Althusser talks about Lenin's theory of the weakest link in these state apparatuses, in these ideological state
Which still
apparatuses.
holds true. Like if you think about the,
Yeah.
I was thinking about the truckers in Canada. They found themselves a nice little choke point.
That's right. Yeah. In the supply chain or whatever you want to call it.
I think
That-
the data centers are the new railroad, to reference Lenin there as well. But
Yes.
I won't elaborate on that little point.
That gets us into partly, it at least resonates into something that Baudrillard says with the spirit of terrorism and the rise of computer viruses, right? I mean, I think that that's part of what you're talking about with the data centers being weak points, but also just the I love you virus that he uses as an example, right? It's
Yeah. Well, I mean, even more topically with Ukraine, whenever Ukraine was a very large producer of, I guess, a lot of Bitcoin and crypto blockchain type stuff was housed in Ukraine. And so that whenever the rumblings were going on in the prelude to the war, there were some pretty severe swings, I think, at least in terms of Bitcoin's value. So it just absolutely goes to this phenomenon, I think. But I didn't really have much else.
Yeah, I think that
Overall.
it's okay if this episode is not super long. I mean, we have been almost recording for 2 hours, probably an hour 45.
I mean, I'm feeling really good about what we did today, honestly.
Oh yeah,
I feel very good. Like one of my better showings, I think.
well, you
in recent memory.
You did excellent, and I think it's important. We kind of stepped out of our normal milieu, our normal métier.
I liked our very unorthodox reading of this, or at least that's kind of the way that I was looking at it. It was like,
I like that we linked it back to stuff we're interested in.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
that's the point. And it's not just to reject, to show its importance, but just to show that it perhaps has its merits and its faults. Is it anything?
There are points of harmony and disjunction with a lot of the discussions we've had, and I think that was valuable. And
yeah, I think this is good, and it's a good place we can stop.
I hope everyone enjoyed the very unorthodox reading of Althusser today, and that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. Peace.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. To the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people as in Clockwork Orange.